Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week of our Bible study here on Wednesday nights. We're going to be continuing in John chapter 18 tonight. Hopefully, we won't have to do too many more of these. Within a week or so, hopefully, we'll be getting back to our regular services. But I hope these classes have been helpful to you, and it's certainly better than having no organized study at all. I apologize. Last week, there was something going on with the audio that I didn't know was going on until the recording was done. And being the lazy guy that I am, I wasn't going to record the whole thing again. I think I got those things figured out now, though, and we're going to go ahead and get going. Now, we're in John chapter 18, and we just really covered the first 3 verses last week of this chapter, and it's dealing with the arrest of Jesus. We've got a police car going by in the background. I apologize for that. So we talked about the fact that Jesus and his disciples went out to the Mount of Olives. That was outside the city wall. They had gone out to the eastern side of the city. There's a valley, and there was a brook Kidron that is mentioned, and he crosses that and goes up into the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And it's there that Judas shows up with the soldiers who have come to arrest Jesus. Judas knew about that garden, so Jesus wasn't trying to hide or anything of that nature. When Jesus was, when he did not want to be arrested, they could not arrest him. He would not allow it when he still had work to finish. But as we saw in John 17, that work was done. He says to his Father, and now he knows the time has come for him to die. And so he's there in the garden waiting for them to come and arrest him. We talked about the fact that John leaves several things out, and as we go through our study, I'll be bringing in some of the other occurrences that take place now, just so we can be thorough and get a good picture of everything that goes on right here during this last day of Jesus's life. So John 18, we're going to start today at verse 4, and we'll get going here. Let's go ahead and read it together. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." So the soldiers show up now as they're there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and now John just mentions that Judas was with him. Now, of course, we know from other accounts that Judas had made arrangements with the guards that he would go and identify Jesus with a kiss. And we read about that in Matthew 26, 48 and 49. His betrayer had given them a sign saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And so he identifies Jesus with a kiss. Now, most of these men had probably seen Jesus before. He didn't try to hide from them, but it was dark, and perhaps some of them hadn't. So Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss. I couldn't help but think about what Jesus must have been thinking and feeling as Judas approaches him. Now, Jesus knows what's going on. He knows that he is being betrayed with a kiss by one of his disciples. I would imagine he was very, very sad and hurt that Judas was doing this. Probably comparable to one of us, seeing our children who are about to make a big mistake, walking as you would, like off a cliff, so to speak, and you know that they're doing something they're going to regret, something that's going to change their lives for the worse, but not being able to stop them. Well, I imagine that's probably the way that Jesus felt there as Judas comes and gives him a kiss. And Jesus says, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" I sense sadness in that, not so much anger or bitterness or anything of that. I sense sadness and the fact that, Jesus loved Judas, but he certainly could not condone his actions. And he felt, I think, terrible for Judas in the poor decisions that he had made. Now, there's something interesting in this passage. It's all interesting, but something that is interesting to think about and talk about. It says that they come and Jesus asks, "Whom are you seeking?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, "I am he." Literally, "I am." The idea of him being the "I am," he identifies himself. And it says in verse 6 that they drew back and fell to the ground when he said that. This is one of those examples where the Bible does not give us as much information as we would like to have. I want to know why they drew back and fell to the ground. What was it that made them draw back and fall to the ground? Was there something in the way that Jesus said it that made them do that, that scared them? Did his voice get louder or booming like thunder or something? We're not told. Was there something in his appearance? Did he begin to glow, maybe like he did on the Mount of Transfiguration or something? We're not told. Was there some kind of just miraculous force that forced them to the ground and to show obeisance by falling down before Jesus? We're not told. But there was something that happened there that caused them to fall to the ground. It says again in verse 6, they drew back and fell to the ground. I think one of the things that implies, that should have implied to them as well, is that Jesus, even though he's allowing them to come and arrest him, he's still in control. And he could have put a stop to it at any time that he chose to. He is submitting to them and allowing them to arrest him. They were not doing anything to him that he couldn't stop. He was not helpless. So whatever caused them to, fall back and fall to the ground, it doesn't matter. What it does tell us is that Jesus was still the one in control, and they knew it. Okay, they understood that he was not just a normal man, and it's it does surprise me that knowing that then they go through with arresting him, and then later on with beating him and things of that nature. So in verse 8 there in John 18, Jesus has the soldiers let his disciples go. And really, again, after this demonstration of his power, whatever it was that caused them to fall, they knew that if Jesus didn't want his disciples arrested, they were not going to be able to arrest them anyway. And so, they allow the disciples to go. And the implication being that at least Jesus assumed that, if they were arrested with him, they may have been killed too. Very, very likely. If they had been arrested with him, their lives were in danger as well. God allows his people in the scriptures to die from time to time. I mean, he allows them to die for their faith. We read about that in the scriptures. But these disciples, while eventually, they were going to die in service to Christ, their work has just begun. And God was not going to allow them to perish at this time because they had work still to do. And so Jesus says, "Let my disciples go," and they do. And they flee at that time. Now, going on here, beginning at verse 10 in John 18, we read, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?' Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him." Okay, so here we have the account of Peter drawing his sword and striking the servant of the high priest. This whole thing, again, is very interesting. As you know, before they went to the garden, there was a bit of a discussion about the swords. If you want to look in your Bible or look here at the screen at Luke 22, beginning at verse 35, Jesus, it says, he said to them, when I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? So they said, nothing. Then he said to them, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end. So they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. So he makes reference back to the times when he had sent his disciples out. And he had told them at that time really to rely on the hospitality of others and to trust in God for protection, basically. They weren't to take any weapons. They weren't to take any provisions. They were to rely on the hospitality of others because a workman is worthy of his hire. But now he says this, you're getting different marching orders now, sort of. He tells them to be prepared, okay, when they go out. And he tells them, he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Let me just stop there and say, if ever you needed scriptural authority for self-defense, I think certainly this is it. Jesus here tells them, if you don't have a sword, you need to get one. A sword is a weapon for defense. I mean, it could be an offensive weapon, but it's a weapon to use against other people. It's not a hunting instrument or anything like that. It was for protection. And so certainly there's nothing wrong with a follower of Christ protecting himself, protecting his family, or protecting others. Again, there are some who call themselves Christians who say that it is wrong to do violence under any condition to anyone. We call them pacifists. And that idea is foreign to the scriptures. Jesus says if you don't have a sword, you get one. So a sword is necessary for self-protection. They say, okay, Lord, we have 2 swords here. And we know from the account that, Peter had one of them because Peter is the one who draws his sword. And then Jesus says, in regard to the 2 swords, it is enough. What exactly he meant by that, it's unclear, but I take it to mean this. I take it to mean that in Jesus's view, 2 swords were enough to protect them from thieves and other lowlifes who might try to accost them. Obviously, Jesus didn't have in mind that these swords were going to be used to defend him from the soldiers who were coming to arrest him. But nevertheless, I mean, it was even worse then than it is today, and in the sense of, it wasn't uncommon to be mugged, to be attacked by thieves and things of that nature. So I think when he says it's enough, he's saying that's enough for protection for us to get us to the garden safely, and the things that are going to occur after that are going to occur. So Jesus did not forbid the bringing of those swords. But it's safe to say from his reaction to Peter here, when Peter does attack them, that he never intended for those swords to be used in defending himself against arrest by the Romans. He wasn't going to fight the government, so to speak, even though the arrest was unjust and unfair. He wasn't going to fight this. So I think the reason he allowed the 2 swords was for self-protection, okay? Not with a view toward protecting him from arrest, but just for the disciples to protect themselves. Again, Peter draws his sword now, and he cuts off the right ear of Malchus. It's interesting, John's the only one who gives us the name of the servant of the high priest, and that's probably because he knew the name. We're going to read here in a little bit that John is known to the high priest. He knew personally the high priest, and so he would have known his servants as well, quite possibly. Peter draws his sword, cuts off the ear of the high servant, and the servant of the... Did I say high servant? I did. The ear of the servant of the high priest. Those of you who have heard me speak about this have heard me say I firmly believe he wasn't aiming for his ear. If you're going to attack somebody, are you going to try to aim to cut off their ear? I don't think so. I just think it's safe to say that Malchus was fortunate that Peter was a fisherman and not a swordsman, okay? Because I firmly believe Peter was probably trying to take his head off, and this guy ducked or Peter missed in some way, and instead of losing his head, he lost an ear. Now, we read in the other gospel accounts that Jesus heals Malchus's ear. He reattaches it, puts it back on. So again, these soldiers are witness to an undeniable miracle, and yet they still go through with the arrest. It's amazing to me that they could do that. I really don't think I could. But they witness an undeniable miracle. His ear is healed, but they still arrest him. Now, Jesus tells Peter to put his sword back up. Shall I not drink the cup which the Father has given me? Remember, in the garden, Jesus had prayed, Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. Well, the Father's will, and therefore Jesus' will, was that he die. And he had to be arrested first. And so he's not going to fight against that. When he prayed that, nevertheless, not my will, but your will, he meant it. He was ready and willing to die. He didn't need Peter to defend him. As he says in other accounts, he could have called legions of angels to come to his defense if he wanted to be delivered from this. And so Peter's actions, while in a way are admirable, really when you boil it down, he's fighting against God here. He's trying to thwart the plan of God that he didn't understand. Okay, he just knows he loves Jesus, and he's willing to die for Jesus. So one of the things that his actions here tell us about him is that Peter was courageous. Okay, this is a group of soldiers. And remember last time we said it could have been up to 200 armed men had come to arrest Jesus, and Peter's ready to take them on. Him and, again, there's one other sword in their group. We don't know who that was, but he's ready, and so he attacks. So he's a courageous man, and he certainly loved the Lord and was willing to die. We remember he promised, or he told Jesus that he was ready to die. In Matthew 26, beginning of verse 33, Peter says to Jesus, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And then we have Jesus's prediction. Assuredly, I say to you that this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. So Peter says, even if I have to die, I will. And I think his actions right here show us that he meant it. You don't take a sword out to attack 200 men and think you're going to get out of it okay. This was sort of, in my mind, a last charge by Peter. He's ready to go out. He's going to go out defending Jesus. Admirable. Again, with the bravery and the devotion, but he didn't understand really what he was doing. And that can be said about Peter and his actions a lot of times, and us as well, I'm sure. So he wants to defend Jesus. Now, Jesus had told him, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And so what we're going to see in Peter is he goes now from being willing to die, and I really, again, think that this action here, he was, if Jesus had let things go on, he would have died. But he goes from that amount of bravery, devotion, and courage to denying the Lord 3 times. And we'll talk about some of the things that played a part in that. And we've talked about that before. Many of you have been in Bible classes where we've talked about that. Okay. We're going to go on now. Verses 13 through 18 of John chapter 18. It says, they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Okay, so both Annas and Caiaphas in the various accounts are called high priest. We know there was only one. Annas is described as the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He had been deposed in AD 14 as high priest. Remember, by this time, the office of high priest was more of a political thing. These high priests were appointed by the government, and many of them bought their position. It was just completely corrupt. But Annas had been the high priest, and he had been deposed. And the reason he had been deposed or kicked out of the high priest's office was because he had executed a young man who had broken the Sabbath. And the Romans then took him out of authority because that was something that he did not have authority to do. The Romans were the ones who executed lawbreakers, and obviously that's why they end up bringing Jesus to Pilate to have him executed. So Annas was not technically the high priest. Caiaphas was. However, most of the Jews still held Annas in high regard, and viewed him as still the high priest. Even though the Romans had said, "You're gone," he still held a lot of influence and still had a lot of authority, even though technically his son-in-law was the high priest. So I think it says something that first, these soldiers that had arrested Jesus, they brought him to Annas first. Again, what does that say? I think Annas was really the guy who was more respected and more in charge. And he was really the one who was respected as the high priest. Now, it also mentions Caiaphas and mentions that he is the one who had prophesied earlier on. Verse 14, it was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews it was expedient that one man should die for the people. We read about that back in John chapter 11, beginning of verse 49. It says, one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." Now this he said, he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Even though this priesthood, the high priesthood, had been corrupted, God still would sometimes use these men to prophesy. And I think this was an unintentional prophecy, probably. He's trying to justify taking Jesus, putting him to death, before Jesus causes a revolt and causes Rome to come in and wipe them all out. But unknowingly, he was prophesying that, he needs to die for the nation, but not only for the nation of the Jews, but really for the whole world. So it was an unintentional prophecy, so to speak. Now, we're also told that as Jesus now has been brought to Annas, it's most likely that Annas and Caiaphas were both in the same house, the same palace or dwelling, It was probably a very large structure. But he's brought to Annas first, and we're told that Peter and John followed Jesus. Again, John doesn't call himself by name, but he was talking about himself. And we read that Peter followed at a distance or afar off. Mark 14:54, Peter followed him at a distance. So the implication being that John was right there nearby because he was known to the high priest. But Peter followed at more of a distance. And Peter eventually was able to get into the courtyard where they had taken Jesus, because John comes back to the door and talks to the servant watching the door and they let him in. And that's his first denial of Jesus there, because she asks him, are you also one of his disciples? In other words, she knows John is one of Jesus's disciples. Now she says, Peter, are you also one of his disciples? And he denies that he is. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons maybe that he felt it necessary to deny the Lord at this point. And then we're told also that Peter stood at the fire that had been made by the servants and the officers. It was cold, it's said, and he warmed himself there. People often say he warmed himself at Satan's fire. Okay, he had surrounded himself by these wicked people who were arresting Jesus and going to put him to death. And so we have his first denial of Jesus recorded by John here in this passage. Okay. Let's go on. John 18, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, there are several different trials, I guess you would say, that Jesus went through. So first he's gone to Annas, okay, and now Annas asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. He knew Jesus' doctrine, and he knew about his disciples. This was all merely a show, okay? This was a show trial. They already had their plans for Jesus, but he asked them about that, and this, I think, the reason Jesus didn't answer. They knew his doctrine. He hadn't tried to hide it, and so he wasn't going to answer. And he says, I'm not trying to teach anything in secret. Go talk to the people who I've taught if you don't know. And one of the officers then was not satisfied with Jesus' answer, perhaps not satisfied with the manner in which Jesus answered. Maybe he felt that Jesus wasn't showing the right amount of respect or deference to the high priest, and so we're told that he struck Jesus with the palm of his hand. So the physical aspect of Jesus's torment is underway here. This is the first time that John records that he's been physically harmed, but he's struck with the hand. Now, Jesus says, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of that evil. He hadn't said anything evil. He hadn't insulted the high priest. He basically just told him, I'm not going to answer you. So he hadn't spoken evil, and this man was wrong to strike him. Now, and he hadn't been disrespectful either, okay? Now, during this time, John doesn't record it, but we're told in verse 24 that he goes to Caiaphas, that he's sent to Caiaphas. And we know also that during this night of his arrest, he stands before the whole council of the Sanhedrin. And we'll go ahead and read that. Matthew 26, beginning at 59. This is just one of the accounts. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at least 2 false witnesses came forward and said, This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said to him, Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, Hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming in the clouds of heaven. I imagine, let me stop there. High priest was very happy to hear Jesus say that, because that's the whole reason he's asking these questions, is he wants to get Jesus to say something inflammatory like that. Now, again, it's the truth. Jesus wasn't lying. He's speaking the truth. But he wanted Jesus to say something just like that so that they could use that to put him to death. And we're told in verse 65, the high priest tore his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you? So he initially goes to Annas and then Caiaphas, and then again at some point in this evening he appears before the whole council, and false witnesses are brought against him to speak lies and half-truths about the things that he said. The high priest just says, I put you under oath of God, tell us, are you the Christ? And Jesus says, yes, I am. It is as you said. And then, that's all they needed to hear. They had him now saying it with his own two lips, and to them that was enough. It was blasphemy in their eyes for him to say that. Never the mind all the miracles that he had done, never the mind his teaching and all the good that he had done. They wanted him gone. They wanted him put to death. And they used then this opportunity to do that. And so now that they've convicted him and they find that they believe that he's deserving of death, we're told they spit in his face, they beat him, they struck him with the palm of their hands. So his physical abuse has begun now, and it's only going to get worse, what they're going to do to him. But not only the physical abuse, but also the disrespect, the insults that are hurled at him, being spit upon. It's hard for me to fathom how God could allow that, and the amount of love and self-control that it took on Jesus's part to allow that to occur. He could have easily stopped it at any time, but he didn't. He allowed it to occur. He knew that it needed to occur. And the reason that it needed to occur was his love for us, and he wanted our salvation. We're told again that he despised the shame, but he endured what he did for the joy that was set before him. Hebrews chapter 12. Okay, so we will quit there for today. Again, we appreciate you watching this, taking the time to do a little bit of study here in John. We will pick up at verse 25 next week and continue, and hopefully next week will be our last online, and we can start meeting again after that. But thank you. Hope you have a good day. Hope your week's been good. And again, if there's anything you need, any way the leaders of the church can help you, please let us know. We'll be glad to help. We'll see you later. Have a good day, and God bless.